Welcome aboard, and thank you for tuning in to the Captain Podcast. I'm the Captain, your host, and today we're joined by an airline pilot and expert. On this episode, we're diving into a critical topic for every pilot adverse weather operations. Weather can make or break a flight, and knowing how to navigate through challenging conditions is key to safety and efficiency. We'll explore the strategies, tools, and techniques pilots need to handle everything from thunderstorms to low visibility, and how to make real-time decisions when the weather throws a curveball. Whether you're flying small planes or commercial jets, understanding adverse weather operations is crucial. Let's get into it. You know, when most of us think about flying, we might picture a smooth, clear flight. But for pilots, weather isn't just about a bit of turbulence or a slight delay. It's an enormous, undeniable factor in aviation safety. It can be a complete game changer, literally dictating whether a flight takes off, where it goes, and even how it lands.
Oh, absolutely. It's the ultimate wild card, and the numbers, well, they really tell the story. Something like 11% of aircraft accidents are directly attributed to weather conditions.
11%, wow.
Yeah, but here's the more chilling insight. If you broaden that out to general aviation, private planes, smaller commercial stuff, that figure can easily jump to over a quarter. Sometimes it even gets close to half of all aviation accidents where weather is a contributing factor.
Contributing, right. So not necessarily the main cause, but it's in the mix.
Exactly. Think about that for a moment. It means even if the weather isn't the single thing that causes an incident, it's often that hidden accelerant, the thing that turns a maybe manageable issue into a full-blown crisis. Weather is almost always in the room, so to speak, when things go wrong. It's just this force we have to reckon with constantly every single flight.
That's a really profound way to put it, the hidden accelerant. And it's not just, a passing shower we're talking about, is it? The range of adverse weather phenomena seems truly vast.
It really is. You've got the sheer violence of thunderstorms, obviously. Then there's the insidious danger of icing, something that can just destroy lift, turn an elegant wing into, something much less effective.
Like a lead brick, yeah.
Pretty much. And high winds, of course, that can toss even a large aircraft around surprisingly easily. Then you have things like sandstorms, which can just obliterate visibility instantly, or extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, that really push an aircraft's operational limits.
And each of those can impact every single phase of flight, right? From pushback all the way to touchdown.
Every single phase. From the moment you start thinking about pushing back from the gate through taxi, takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, approach, landing, and even taxiing back to the gate. For airline pilots, especially those flying the common workhorses like an Airbus A320 or a Boeing 737, the challenge isn't just, dodging these risks.
Right.
It's about expertly managing them. These aren't small planes that can just sort of weave around a cloud on a whim. These are complex machines operating in a highly regulated system, and every single decision about weather carries immense weight. Often, it involves the safety of hundreds of people.
And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. We want to give you that insider's view, really break down how airline pilots tackle these extraordinary challenges phase by phase. Most people probably assume a flight really starts when the wheels leave the ground, right?
Yep.
But for pilots, the real life-saving work, especially when weather's involved, begins way before that. It starts with meticulous pre-flight planning.
That's absolutely spot on. The bedrock, the foundation of safe weather operations is genuinely thorough pre-flight planning. And it's not just a suggestion or good practice.
It's required.
It's a regulatory mandate. Both pilots and dispatchers have to obtain and really dig into all the available weather information. We're talking about the entire route, the destination airport naturally, and any planned alternate airports. The pilot in command, by regulation, must be thoroughly familiar with current and forecast weather conditions along the entire route of flight. It's truly the first line of defense.
Thoroughly familiar. That sounds like a lot more than just a quick glance at a weather app on your phone. What kind of specific information are you actually poring over in this pre-flight stage to get that deep familiarity?
Oh yeah, it's definitely not the phone app. We're diving deep into a very specific set of meteorological data. We scrutinize MEDARs. Those are the current weather reports and TAFs, the terminal aerodrome forecast.
For everywhere, right. Not just departure and arrival.
Everywhere relevant. Departure, destination, all the points along the route, and crucially, any planned alternate airports. We're also studying significant weather charts, SIGMETs as they're called, which highlight hazardous en route weather like severe turbulence or icing. And then we overlay all of that with radar imagery, especially looking for any convective activity thunderstorms, basically. It's all about building this really comprehensive mental picture of the atmospheric battlefield, if you like.
Okay, so you've got this mountain of data. And within that, there's this concept you mentioned, planning minima. That sounds quite technical, but I gather it's absolutely critical for making sure the flight is safe and, well, legal. Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, it sounds technical, but the concept is pretty straightforward. Think of planning minima as the absolute worst weather an airport can legally have forecast for us to even plan to fly there. It's the baseline requirement.
So it's about the forecast, not necessarily the current weather right now.
Exactly. It's about what's predicted for our arrival time. For instance, let's say your destination airport is forecasting weather below its normal landing minimums. Maybe the visibility or ceiling is too low for a standard approach. You might think, okay, we can't go.
Right. Seems logical.
But legally, under many regulations, you can still depart. Provided, and this is the key part, you've planned not just one, but 2 suitable alternate airports. This gives you critical backup options, that extra layer of safety, if your primary destination stays stubbornly below limits.
2 alternates. Okay, that makes sense. What about the minima for the alternate itself?
Good question. The planning minima for the required alternate isn't necessarily its absolute lowest approach limit. Often, regulations require you to plan based on slightly higher minima, typically derived from the second lowest approach available. So if an alternate has a really precise ILS Category 1 approach and a less precise non-precision approach like a VOR approach,
You plan for the VOR one.
you often plan using the minima for the non-precision approach. You're essentially planning for a slightly worst-case scenario even at your alternate, giving yourself the maximum possible buffer if things really go south, and you absolutely have to factor in any tempo conditions in the forecast.
Tempo meaning temporary.
Exactly. Temporary deteriorations. If the forecast says tempo visibility below minima for part of the arrival window, you have to account for that possibility in your planning, potentially requiring that second alternate or extra fuel. Understanding these nuances is critical, and every airline details the exact rules in their operations manual, usually Part A, so we're always operating according to those specific company procedures, which are approved by the regulators.
It sounds like building safety layer upon safety layer, always having a backup for your backup. So beyond these specific minimum rules, what are some of the really big hazards you're actively looking for in the forecast, like thunderstorms or icing? And what's the general game plan?
Well, the absolute golden rule for thunderstorms is simple: avoidance, not penetration. If we see convective storms forecast along our route, the plan is always to deviate or choose alternate routings to stay well clear of the most severe cells. The standard minimum is 20 nautical miles.
20 miles, that's quite a distance.
It is, and sometimes more is better. And if possible, a subtle but important technique is to circumnavigate storms on the upwind side. This helps keep you out of the path of any potential downdrafts or large hail that might get thrown out on the downwind side of the storm anvil.
Ah, interesting. Upwind side. Okay. What about icing?
For icing, if conditions look favorable for it in the climb or cruise phases, visible moisture and temperatures near or below freezing, it's absolutely vital to check that our anti-ice systems are fully operational before we even leave the gate. And we have to factor their use into our performance planning. Using wing and engine anti-ice does consume some engine bleed air, which can slightly affect takeoff performance and fuel burn, so it has to be part of the calculation.
So weather doesn't just affect how you fly, but potentially how much you can carry. Performance and payload adjustments must be a big part of this pre-flight puzzle.
Oh, a huge part, and it links directly back to basic physics. For example, in really hot weather, or at high-altitude airports, what we call high-density altitude conditions, aircraft performance is significantly degraded.
Because the air is thinner.
Exactly. Thinner air means the engines produce less thrust and the wings generate less lift. This directly translates to longer takeoff distances needed and reduced climb rates after liftoff. So if you're departing from somewhere notoriously hot and high, like Denver or Mexico City in the summer, or maybe even Phoenix during a major heat wave,
You might have to leave people or bags behind.
precisely, you might face weight restrictions. We might literally have to offload passengers or cargo to ensure we have adequate performance margins for a safe takeoff and climb. It's not common, but it happens. And modern large jets like the A320s and 737s actually have maximum certified operating temperatures. Often it's around 52 or 53 degrees Celsius. If the ambient temperature exceeds that, the aircraft simply cannot legally operate.
Wow. So the heat itself can ground you.
Absolutely. This is why using performance calculation tools, usually software on a tablet or laptop with the actual real-time weather data, is absolutely non-negotiable. You can't guess or use old data. The performance calculations tell you definitively if you can safely lift the planned weight under those specific conditions.
Okay, so all this critical data is gathered, analyzed meticulously. How does it then translate into what the crew actually does? What does that briefing and coordination look like in the cockpit before you push back?
For experienced crews, briefing the expected weather isn't just reading off a list, it's a dynamic conversation. We discuss how the anticipated weather might affect our standard procedures. For example, if there's a storm brewing near the departure airport, we'll specifically brief potential wind shear escape maneuvers, what we'll do if we encounter it.
Proactive planning.
Exactly. Or if our primary instrument approach at the destination might be unavailable due to, say, low ceilings, we'll actively plan and brief for alternative approaches. We also coordinate very closely with our dispatcher. They're essentially our partners on the ground, monitoring the flight's progress and the weather constantly. We might discuss changing alternates if conditions shift, or request longer routings to get around big storm systems, always making sure we have the right amount of fuel on board, including extra reserves for potential weather delays or holding.
And it's not just the weather in the air, right? You mentioned NOTAMs too.
Absolutely. The briefing also covers any relevant NOTAMs notices to air missions. These might be weather-related, like, say, the ILS system at the destination being out of service, which would raise our landing minimums. Or maybe there are field condition reports detailing snow or ice accumulation on the runways. It's this continuous, evolving conversation aimed at anticipating and planning for whatever Mother Nature might decide to throw at us that day.
It really does sound like a constant chess match, always trying to think a few moves ahead. And there's a powerful lesson from history, a really tragic one, that underscores why this diligent pre-flight and ongoing weather assessment is so absolutely critical. American Airlines Flight 1420, can you tell us about that incident?
Yes, American 1420, that was an MD-82 trying to land at Little Rock, Arkansas back in 1999, right in the middle of severe thunderstorm conditions. The aircraft overran the runway and sadly there were fatalities.
And weather was the primary cause.
Investigators pointed to it as one of the last major U.S. airline crashes where weather was considered the primary cause. Their findings really powerfully emphasized that better decisions both pre-flight and en route could likely have prevented it. Things like simply waiting out the storm on the ground for a bit longer, or diverting to a nearby airport with better weather.
But they pressed on.
They did. Unfortunately, the crew was dealing with fatigue, under pressure to get in, and they continued the approach into what the captain himself actually called a can of worms thunderstorm. That phrase, in hindsight, is just chilling. It tragically illustrates the danger of underestimating the risks, both in the planning phase and during the critical approach phase when faced with severe weather. It's a stark reminder for all of us.
So the ultimate message here, it seems, is that no matter how much experience a pilot has, you just cannot afford to be complacent when it comes to weather.
Precisely. Zero complacency allowed. Weather demands absolute respect every single time. Careful, conservative go-no-go decisions are paramount. You always have to err on the side of caution. That's how you stay safe.
Okay, so respecting the weather, erring on the side of caution, that inevitably brings us to one of the most critical factors in adverse weather ops, fuel. It really is your life insurance up there, isn't it? Why does fuel management become so fundamentally different when the weather turns sour?
It truly is your ultimate safety net, your get-out-of-jail-free card. Adverse weather fundamentally changes the entire fuel calculation. Suddenly, you're not just planning for A to B. You have to account for potential weather delays, holding patterns, vectors around storms, slower speeds. You might need to divert to an alternate airport entirely. Or maybe you just need a significantly longer routing to circumnavigate a big weather system.
And all of that burns extra gas.
A lot of extra gas. Every single one of those scenarios directly translates to significantly increased fuel burn compared to a clear weather flight plan.
And the regulations certainly reflect this reality, demanding specific extra fuel amounts, contingency fuel, when the weather's looking marginal.
Absolutely, they do. Regulators mandate carrying contingency fuel specifically for holding or for flying to an alternate when the destination weather forecast is marginal. For instance, if your destination weather is forecast to be below the required landing minima around your arrival time, regulations typically require you to list not just one, but 2 suitable alternate airports.
2 alternates again.
And you must carry enough fuel to fly to the further of those 2 alternates, plus your mandatory final reserve fuel, plus any anticipated holding. It's all about ensuring you have enough options and enough time to make safe decisions without feeling rushed by dwindling fuel gauges.
Let's break down some of these key fuel considerations.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is holding fuel? And why is it so common to carry extra when thunderstorms are around?
Holding fuel is exactly what it sounds like. Extra fuel you carry specifically anticipating that you might be put into a holding pattern by air traffic control. This is incredibly common when thunderstorms are forecast near your destination airport.
Because the storms block the approaches.
Yeah. Precisely. Convective cells can effectively block arrival routes and approach paths, forcing ATC to slow down the arrival rate significantly. Carrying that extra holding fuel gives the crew crucial time, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour to wait for conditions to improve, or for the air traffic backlog to clear. It takes the immediate pressure off having to divert the second you encounter a delay. Think about a busy hub like Chicago or Atlanta during summer thunderstorms. The arrival rate can slow to a crawl, aircraft get spaced out dramatically. A flight that didn't plan for holding fuel might quickly find itself needing to divert, while a well-prepared flight can absorb those delays.
Makes sense. And alternate fuel, that seems fairly straightforward enough to get to your alternate plus a reserve.
Yes, that's the basic principle. You must always ensure you have enough fuel to fly from your destination to your planned alternate airport, fly an approach and landing there, plus carry your final reserve fuel, which is typically 30 minutes of flying time for jets, sometimes 45 minutes depending on regulations. But here's the really crucial part: the decision to use that alternate fuel.
Meaning the decision to actually divert.
Exactly. Pilots should never, ever hesitate to divert once it becomes clear the destination can't be reached safely within the remaining fuel endurance. The biggest threat isn't just running out of fuel, though that's obviously catastrophic. It's delaying that diversion decision for too long, hoping things will magically improve.
Letting the fuel get too low before committing.
Right. Airline standard operating procedures, the SOPs, and regulations are very clear on this. You should initiate a diversion no later than the point where you calculate you will reach your alternate with only your final reserve fuel remaining. There are some exceptions for holding over the destination if conditions are improving, but generally that's the trigger point. And pilots are trained to communicate their fuel status clearly. Declaring minimum fuel to ATC isn't an emergency yet.
It's a heads up.
It's a heads up. It tells ATC, look, any undue delay from here on out will force me into my final reserves. It signals urgency without declaring an emergency. However, if fuel levels genuinely fall to emergency levels, meaning you predict landing with less than final reserve fuel, then a Mayday declaration is absolutely mandatory. That clear, unambiguous communication is paramount.
That distinction between minimum fuel and Mayday, it's a really important part of the safety system, that communication hierarchy.
Critically important.
And speaking of balancing acts, there's this delicate dance pilots have to do between carrying enough extra fuel for safety and the increased weight that extra fuel adds. How do you go about right-sizing the fuel load?
Yes, the classic aviation trade-off. It truly is. While just tankering tons of extra fuel for every possible weather scenario might seem like the safest option.
More's better, right?
Not necessarily. If you carry too much extra fuel, it makes the aircraft significantly heavier. This increases your takeoff distance required, reduces your climb performance, and can actually increase your fuel burn during the cruise phase because you're carrying all that dead weight. So it can become counterproductive, both economically and sometimes even from a performance safety perspective.
So how do you find the sweet spot?
Experienced pilots, working closely with dispatchers, use sophisticated flight planning software and their own judgment, based on the specific route, the aircraft type, and the nature of the weather threat. The goal is to right-size the fuel load. Enough margin for safety and anticipated contingencies, but not so much that it unduly limits aircraft performance or becomes excessively inefficient. For example, for a flight into an airport known for frequent fog, tankering enough fuel for potential missed approach, hold, and diversion might be standard practice. But for a shorter flight where severe widespread thunderstorms are the main threat, listing multiple suitable alternates might be a better strategy than loading up massive amounts of extra fuel, especially if that extra weight would push you close to maximum landing weight limits at your destination or alternates. It's all about risk assessment and choosing the right tool for the job.
And what happens if the weather forecast you planned for changes drastically while you're already en route? How do you make those critical fuel adjustments in the air?
That happens all the time. Despite the best pre-flight planning, weather is dynamic, it evolves. So pilots must continuously monitor their fuel status and update their fuel predictions based on actual conditions versus the plan. Modern flight management systems, FMS, and data link communications with dispatch are invaluable here. We get updated weather reports, wind data, and revised fuel predictions constantly.
So you always know how much fuel you should have at the next waypoint.
Exactly, and how much you're predicted to have at the destination and alternate. If unanticipated headwinds are stronger than forecast, or if ATC gives you significant deviations around weather that weren't planned, and you see your fuel burn is higher than expected, well, those diversion decisions must be made early. You make the call before fuel becomes critical. The absolute key here is to consciously fight against get-there-itis.
That urge to just push on to the original destination no matter what.
That's the one. It's a well-known psychological trap in aviation. You must never press on when fuel is dwindling, just hoping the weather at the destination will suddenly, miraculously improve. That's gambling, and you simply cannot afford to gamble with fuel and weather.
This all brings to mind another stark, tragic lesson from aviation history, Avianca Flight 052. That seems like a classic, devastating example of fuel management and weather planning going terribly wrong.
Avianca 052. Yes, a truly heartbreaking accident. That was a Boeing 707 back in 1990. They were flying into New York JFK and got caught in a perfect storm, figuratively and literally. They encountered extensive holding patterns due to a crushing combination of dense fog and severe air traffic congestion over the New York area.
Multiple holds.
And tragically, the crew ran out of fuel, all 4 engines flamed out, and the aircraft crashed on Long Island, killing 73 people. A major contributing factor identified was the crew's failure to declare a fuel emergency using clear, standardized terminology that ATC would immediately understand. They mentioned they were low on fuel, but didn't use the critical emergency phrasing until it was far too late. They also delayed the decision to divert to their alternate, Boston, while they still had sufficient fuel and options.
That accident must have sent shockwaves through the industry. How did it change things globally?
Immensely. It became a critical case study worldwide. Airlines profoundly revamped their fuel management training. Standardized phraseology became absolutely critical, making that distinction between minimum fuel and emergency fuel explicit, universally understood, and mandatory. Procedures were tightened to ensure crews constantly monitor fuel status and predict landing fuel well in advance. Experienced crews today deeply understand that it is far, far better to divert to your alternate while you still have plenty of fuel and options, rather than pressing on into challenging weather or holding patterns with tanks running low. Because bad weather can block you from landing for much, much longer than you might ever anticipate. In essence, fuel truly is your life insurance in adverse weather. You plan for it generously, manage it vigilantly, and never, ever hesitate to use it to get safely on the ground somewhere. It's the ultimate safety net.
So we've covered meticulous planning, vigilant fuel management, but even before the aircraft gets anywhere near takeoff power, the ground itself can become a pretty treacherous environment. Taxi and ground operations in adverse weather that brings its own unique set of hazards, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. People often focus on the flying part, but the ground phase can be just as challenging, sometimes more so in certain conditions. Low visibility from fog or heavy snow, heavy rain making surfaces slick, actual snow or ice contamination on taxiways and runways. It all demands exceptionally careful ground operations.
And airports have specific procedures for this, right? Low visibility procedures.
Yes, many major airports implement low visibility procedures, or LVP, when the visibility, usually measured by runway visual range, RVR, drops below certain values, often around 1,200 feet or 400 meters RVR. These procedures provide extra guidance and control. For instance, they might activate Special Surface Movement Guidance and Control System, or SMGCS, lighting.
SMGCS lighting, what does that involve?
It usually includes things like green taxiway centerline lights that guide you along the path, red stop bars at runway holding points that you absolutely cannot cross without clearance, and sometimes pulsating runway guard lights to really grab your attention before entering a runway. It's basically like having luminous breadcrumbs to follow when you can barely see the end of your own wing. It's designed specifically to prevent pilots from getting lost or inadvertently taxiing onto an active runway in very poor visibility.
Okay, so as a pilot, what are the practical challenges? What's it actually like trying to taxi a huge airliner when you can only see, say, a few hundred feet ahead? It must feel like driving in a thick soup.
It's very much like that, but maybe even trickier because you don't have the same tactile feedback as driving a car. From the cockpit, visibility might be severely reduced. Yeah, sometimes just a few hundred feet. In those conditions, you have to use every available tool. We rely heavily on detailed airport moving map displays on our navigation screens. They show our aircraft's exact position on the airport surface.
Like a GPS for the airport.
Exactly like that. And we very carefully follow the airport's taxiway lighting cues. Those green centerline lights become your lifeline. The absolute golden rule we follow is never taxi faster than you can safely stop within the distance you can actually see. In really low visibility, this often means restricting taxi speed to maybe 10 knots maximum, sometimes even slower on turns.
Just crawling along?
Pretty much. And if you need to focus inside the cockpit for a moment, maybe to run a checklist item or program something into the flight management system, the recommended technique in dense fog is actually to come to a complete stop first. This prevents you from inadvertently drifting off the taxiway centerline while your attention is momentarily diverted. Maintaining a sterile cockpit minimal non-essential chat is vital. Both pilots need to be heads up, closely monitoring signs, markings, and outside references. Turning on all exterior lights, taxi lights, strobe lights, beacons helps make your aircraft more visible to other traffic and vehicles. And clear, concise crew callouts like confirming clear left and clear right before crossing intersections and constantly anticipating your clearance limits are absolutely key to prevent runway incursions or ground collisions.
Beyond just not being able to see, what about when the surface itself is the problem? Snow, ice, even just heavy rain making things slick or flooding on the taxiways. How does that change how you handle the aircraft on the ground?
Slippery or contaminated surfaces create major traction and control challenges. On snowy or icy taxiways, you have to taxi incredibly slowly and cautiously, anticipating much, much longer braking distances needed to stop. We use the absolute minimum thrust necessary to keep moving, avoiding sudden power changes that could induce a skid. Gentle turns are key, sometimes using a bit of differential thrust, more power on the outside engine, or differential braking can help coax the aircraft around a tight turn on a slick surface.
And you rely on reports about the runway condition.
Absolutely. Paying close attention to runway condition codes, or RWICC, and pilot braking action reports is essential. If previous aircraft are reporting poor or nil braking, you treat that runway or taxiway with extreme caution and assume you'll have minimal braking effectiveness yourself. Standing water or slush also poses risks. You want to avoid taxiing quickly through deep puddles to minimize the chance of hydroplaning or splashing water and slush into the engines or wheel wells. And after taxiing through significant snow or slush, it's standard procedure to perform a flight control check before takeoff to ensure no accumulation is restricting movement.
Little details matter, like engine anti-ice.
Yes, definitely. It's worth remembering that most airliner anti-skid systems have a minimum operating speed on an A320, for instance. It's typically around 20 knots. Below that speed, you don't have anti-skid protection. Also, if you're using engine anti-ice during taxi, as you often are in icing conditions, it usually results in a slightly higher idle thrust. This means the aircraft has a greater tendency to accelerate on its own, requiring more frequent braking and even more careful speed management.
All these subtle factors add up. And speaking of ice, ground de-icing and anti-icing procedures. These are absolute lifelines in winter conditions, aren't they?
Yeah.
How do pilots manage that whole process?
Lifelines is exactly the right word. They are completely non-negotiable. In freezing precipitation snow, freezing rain, sleet, getting properly de-iced and anti-iced is critical for a safe takeoff. You simply cannot take off with any frost, ice, or snow adhering to the critical surfaces of the aircraft.
Critical surfaces being?
Wings, tail surfaces, horizontal and vertical stabilizers, flight control surfaces like ailerons and elevators and engine inlets. Any contamination there can disrupt airflow, reduce lift, increase drag, or even cause control problems. So we coordinate very closely with the ground de-icing crews. We need to know exactly what type of fluid they're applying, and crucially, we need to note our holdover time.
Holdover time, that's how long the protection lasts.
Exactly. It's the estimated period that the applied anti-icing fluid will prevent new ice or snow from accumulating or reforming on the protected surfaces. And this clock starts ticking from the very beginning of the final anti-icing fluid application. Knowing which fluid type was used, type 1 for de-icing, types 2, 3, or 4 for longer-lasting anti-icing, and exactly when that holdover time began is paramount. Because if that time expires before you take off, maybe due to a long taxi delay or ATC hold,
You have to go back.
you absolutely must return to the de-icing pad for reapplication. There is zero compromise on this. It's called the clean aircraft concept. Pilots also have to factor the de-icing process into their taxi planning. You try to choose taxi routes that minimize exposure to blowing snow after you've been treated, and you have to be careful about engine run-ups, as high-thrust settings can potentially blow snow or slush back onto the airframe or wings. The critical warning here, the absolute iron rule, is Never, ever attempt takeoff with any snow, ice, or frost contamination on critical surfaces. A truly chilling reminder of why this is so vital is the Air Florida Flight 90 accident in Washington, D.C. back in 1982.
The Potomac crash.
That's the one. A Boeing 737 attempted takeoff from Washington National Airport with snow and ice contaminating its wings, and also with insufficient engine anti-ice selected. The aircraft failed to gain altitude, stalled aerodynamically almost immediately after liftoff, and crashed into the 14th Street Bridge and then the Fraser Potomac River. 78 people died. The NTSB investigation clearly cited the crew's failure to properly de-ice and their decision to attempt takeoff with wing contamination as primary causes. The lesson is unequivocal. De-icing is mandatory. It's non-negotiable in winter conditions, no matter how much schedule pressure you might feel.
That's a powerful and incredibly tragic reminder of the potential consequences. What about thunderstorm precautions while you're still on the ground? It's not just about the rain, is it? There are other serious hazards.
Definitely not just the rain. If lightning is detected in the immediate vicinity of the airport, typically within about 5 nautical miles, many airports will impose a ramp closure or lightning alert. All ground handling operations, including fueling and baggage loading, cease for the safety of ground personnel. As flight crew, you simply have to exercise patience during these delays. Lives are potentially at risk on the ground.
What about hail?
If hail is occurring at the airport, you should seriously consider delaying your taxi or takeoff. Hailstones, even small ones driven by wind, can cause significant dents and damage to the aircraft's skin, engine fan blades, or engine inlets, even while it's just sitting on the ground or taxiing slowly. We mentioned Southern Airways Flight 242 earlier, the DC-9 that lost both engines after flying through hail. If that kind of hail is happening at the airport, the prudent action is always to wait it out safely parked, rather than risk damage during taxi or takeoff.
And wind shear alerts, they apply on the ground too.
Absolutely. Microbursts and wind shear can occur near thunderstorms, and airports often have Doppler radar or low-level wind shear alert systems, LLWAS, to detect them. If ATC reports a microburst alert or wind shear condition on or near your departure runway, you hold your position. Delay the takeoff. It is far, far better to wait safely on the taxiway than to launch directly into a known wind shear condition.
So, wrapping up ground operations, it sounds like vigilance, patience, and a healthy dose of caution are absolutely the name of the game.
Precisely. Take absolutely nothing for granted on the ground in bad weather. Visibility can be deceptive. Surfaces can be treacherous. You need to use all the available aids, lighting, markings, airport diagrams. Keep your speed appropriate for the conditions, slow enough to stop well within the distance you can see, and maintain clear, unambiguous communication with air traffic control. If you are ever unsure of your position or your clearance, you stop the aircraft and ask for clarification. There's an old saying among high-time airline captains. There's no such thing as a minor ground accident. A runway incursion, taxiing off the pavement, or a collision with another aircraft or vehicle in bad weather can be just as catastrophic as an in-flight emergency. So, you treat taxiing with the exact same level of respect and attention as you do takeoff or landing, especially when the weather is foul.
Okay, so if ground operations are that critical, then takeoff is truly where the rubber meets the runway. Quite literally. It's a real make-or-break phase where weather has this profound effect on aircraft performance and controllability. What's that final, maybe gut check assessment look like right before you commit to rolling down that runway?
That final moment just before advancing the thrust levers is incredibly crucial. It's almost a moment of final confirmation. Before rolling, pilots mentally tick us several critical items. Are the reported winds absolutely within the aircraft's limits, considering both the steady wind and any gusts, and especially the crosswind component?
Crosswind is key.
Always. Is the runway surface condition truly suitable for takeoff? Meaning, is it clear of significant standing water, snow, ice, or debris that could affect acceleration or control? Are all the necessary anti-ice systems turned on if conditions warrant? It's also absolutely prohibited by most operators to use reduced thrust takeoff settings, sometimes called FLEX thrust or assumed temperature thrust on contaminated runways. You need maximum available power in those situations. And one last good practice, a quick visual scan of the wings, if possible from the cockpit, just before lining up, to ensure no ice or snow has accumulated during taxi.
Okay, so you've run the checks, you've made the decision, you're cleared for takeoff. What are the major weather concerns that really kick in during the takeoff roll itself?
Right. As soon as you start moving, several things become critical. First and foremost, the runway surface condition itself. A wet or contaminated runway snow, slush, standing water will significantly lengthen the required takeoff roll and reduce your acceleration rate. The flight crew has to ensure that thrust advances symmetrically on both engines. Any asymmetry could cause a dangerous swerve. Any tendency for the aircraft to deviate from the runway centerline, especially in a crosswind, must be corrected immediately and smoothly. Using the rudder pedals, they become very effective at higher speeds.
Hydroplaning's a risk, too.
Hydroplaning is a very real risk on runways with significant standing water or slush. Ensuring a firm, positive rotation at the correct speed, not rotating too early or too gently, can help the wheels break through the water layer and maintain directional control. Crosswinds combined with a slick runway demand incredibly delicate rudder inputs and precise thrust management to stay on that centerline. And if heavy rain is falling, two things can happen. Engine spool up might be slightly slower than normal due to water ingestion, and critically, visibility through the windscreen can momentarily drop to near zero because of the sheer volume of water spray kicked up by the wheels during the high-speed part of the roll.
Instant IFR, you called it earlier.
Exactly. You have to be mentally prepared for that instant IFR sensation. If the outside world disappears for a second or two just before rotation, you must trust your instruments, primarily the attitude indicator, to set the correct pitch attitude for liftoff.
Wow, that takes immense trust in your instruments and training. What about density, altitude, and heat? That's not something people typically think of as adverse weather, but I understand it can be just as limiting performance-wise as a blizzard.
You've hit on a really important, often underappreciated factor. High-density altitude caused by high temperatures, high airport elevation, or a combination of both is a huge performance limiter. As we said, the air is thinner, less dense. That means less mass flowing through the engine, so less thrust, and less mass flowing over the wings, so less lift.
So everything works less well.
Fundamentally, yes. This leads directly to sluggish acceleration on the runway and reduced climb performance after liftoff. Pilots must be extra vigilant to achieve the correct rotation speed, VR. Rotating too early in thin air can be dangerous. And then you need to promptly establish the correct pitch attitude for the initial climb. It's often necessary to accept a significantly reduced climb gradient on very hot days or from high-altitude airports. You absolutely have to ensure that even with that degraded performance, you can still safely clear all obstacles along the departure path and meet any required climb gradients for the departure procedure.
Are there operational limits related to engine temps, too?
Yes. In extreme heat, you also have to be mindful of engine temperature limits during the takeoff roll, usually exhaust gas temperature, or EGT. Some operators might even choose to turn off the air conditioning packs for takeoff, or utilize rolling takeoffs where you don't stop at the end of the runway but smoothly transition from taxi to the takeoff roll, specifically to reduce engine strain and keep temperatures within limits in very high heat conditions. And remember that Phoenix example. Regional jets grounded at 49 degrees Celsius because their operating manuals literally had no performance data above 47 degrees.
Right, they couldn't legally fly.
Exactly. It wasn't about comfort. It was about fundamental physics and documented aircraft limitations, dictating whether a flight could even operate that day. Even the big jets, the Airbuses and Boeings, have their limits, generally around 52, 53 degrees C. The absolute takeaway here is that hot weather can effectively ground flights if it exceeds the aircraft's certified limits, or if the available runway simply isn't long enough to achieve the necessary ground speed for liftoff in those thin air conditions. You must always verify that your aircraft performance data covers the day's conditions and plan accordingly, potentially accepting payload restrictions.
So heat can be just as much of a showstopper as a blizzard. But perhaps the most acute, immediate threat during takeoff is wind shear and microbursts. Can you quickly define again what a microburst is and why it's uniquely dangerous right after liftoff?
A microburst is a sudden, intense, localized downburst of wind, often associated with thunderstorms, but not always that slams down towards the ground and then spreads out horizontally. If an aircraft flies through one shortly after takeoff, it first encounters a strong headwind, increasing airspeed and lift, then a powerful downdraft pushing it towards the ground, and finally a rapidly increasing tailwind, causing a dramatic loss of airspeed and lift. This rapid sequence can overwhelm the aircraft's ability to climb, often forcing it downwards uncontrollably.
And modern airliners have systems to detect this.
Yes, thankfully. Most modern airliners are equipped with sophisticated onboard wind shear detection systems. There are generally two types. Reactive systems, which detect actual hazardous changes in the aircraft's flight path and energy state, triggering a warning like wind shear, and predictive systems, which use forward-looking Doppler weather radar to scan ahead of the aircraft for potential wind shear conditions, providing an advisory like wind shear ahead. So what are the crucial actions? Well, even before starting the takeoff roll, after lining up, it's a good practice to take a final look at the weather radar display, scanning the departure path for any intent cells. If you get a predictive wind shear alert, wind shear ahead before reaching V1, your takeoff decision speed, the standard procedure is to reject the takeoff immediately. Abort. However, it's critical to know that these warnings are often inhibited during certain phases of takeoff to prevent nuisance warnings. For example, on many Airbus aircraft, predictive warnings might be inhibited above 100 knots until the aircraft is 50 feet in the air. So, pilots can't rely solely on the technology. They must also use their judgment based on visual cues or ATC reports. If a reactive warning, wind shear, occurs after V1 or once airborne, the crew must immediately execute the wind shear escape maneuver from memory. This typically involves applying maximum available thrust, disconnecting the autopilot and autothrottle if engaged, and pitching up towards a specific target attitude or following flight director guidance, accepting potential airspeed loss while prioritizing climb.
And the pilot monitoring plays a key role here.
Absolutely vital. The pilot monitoring, PM, calls out critical information like airspeed trends, airspeed decreasing, vertical speed, radar altitude, and confirms the pilot flying, PF, is taking the correct actions. The PM is also responsible for informing ATC about the wind shear encounter as soon as workload permits, reporting the altitude and location. And even without an explicit audible warning, pilots are trained to recognize the symptoms of entering wind shear. Large, unexpected airspeed fluctuations, plus or minus 15 knots or more, significant heading or track changes, large vertical speed changes, 500 feet per minute or more deviation from normal, or unusual thrust lever movements if the autothrottle is engaged. It's about feeling the aircraft behaving erratically and reacting instantly. Your specific aircraft operating manual will detail these indications precisely.
History has shown just how lethal undetected wind shear can be on takeoff. Pan Am Flight 759 is that chilling example where there was virtually no warning before impact.
It is indeed. Pan Am 759, a Boeing 727, took off from New Orleans in 1982, flew directly into a powerful microburst just moments after liftoff. The aircraft was violently forced down into a residential neighborhood, killing all 145 people on board and several on the ground. From the cockpit voice recorder, it was clear there was virtually no warning. One moment, things seemed relatively normal. Seconds later, the aircraft was rapidly descending due to the devastating combination of downdraft and increasing tailwind.
But those accidents led to major changes.
Absolutely. The series of wind shear-related accidents in the 1970s and 80s, including Pan Am 759 and Delta 191 later, spurred massive investment in research, leading to the development of today's onboard detection systems, ground-based Doppler radar at airports, and vastly improved pilot training on wind shear recognition and recovery techniques. Today, pilots rigorously brief for potential wind shear if thunderstorms are anywhere near the departure path. If the tower reports a microburst alert or confirmed wind shear on or near your departure runway, you simply do not take off. You wait. The overriding lesson learned is absolute. No aircraft, regardless of its power or technology, can reliably outmuscle a severe microburst close to the ground. Avoidance is the only guaranteed strategy.
A powerful testament to learning from tragedy and improving safety systems. What about the engines themselves during takeoff in bad weather? Can heavy rain, hail, or even dust cause problems? How does a pilot think about aborting the takeoff in those situations?
Yeah, engine ingestion is definitely a concern in certain conditions. While modern jet engines are incredibly robust and designed to handle significant amounts of rain, extremely heavy tropical downpour levels of rain have, on very rare occasions, caused momentary engine surges or even flameouts if the water ingestion rate is sudden and massive.
Hail must be worse.
Hail is definitely worse. Taking off into a hail shaft could cause severe damage to engine fan blades or the compressor stages. And while volcanic ash isn't technically weather, blowing sand or dust storms certainly are. You absolutely must avoid taking off into a known dense dust storm. Engines can ingest abrasive dust, leading to erosion, loss of performance, and potentially significant internal damage.
So what are the mitigation strategies?
If takeoff must be performed in conditions with heavy rain or potential icing, we always use continuous ignition. This helps prevent or recover from a potential flameout. We might also consider using a slightly higher takeoff power setting if performance allows and it's permitted by procedures, simply to get through the zone of heavy precipitation or potential shear more quickly. But you always have an abort plan firmly in mind. If the engines don't spool up normally during the initial acceleration, if you get abnormal engine indications, or if visibility out the windshield drops to absolute zero in a sudden downpour before you reach V1, rejecting the takeoff might be the safest course of action provided you have calculated you have enough runway remaining to stop safely from that speed. But remember that crucial dividing line. After V1, you are committed to flight. You continue the takeoff, handle the situation once airborne, climb to a safe altitude, and then sort things out. Potentially planning for a diversion if an engine was damaged or performance is degraded.
Okay, so you're airborne, you've navigated the takeoff phase. Now you're into the climb out. And en route, or cruise, part of the flight. Even up at higher altitudes, Mother Nature can still throw some serious curveballs. Thankfully, modern airliners have pretty sophisticated tools and ATC support these days.
They do, which certainly helps. But yeah, the challenges don't disappear just because you're at 35,000 feet. One of the primary concerns during climb and cruise remains turbulence. This can be either convective turbulence associated with thunderstorms or developing clouds, or it can be clear air turbulence, CA.
Let's talk convective first. How do you handle climbing through cloud layers that might be bumpy?
Climbing out, especially if departing near areas with developing thunderstorms, can definitely involve some bumps. If we see intense radar echoes along our climb path, we'll coordinate with ATC right away to request vectors or deviations to avoid the worst of it again. That 20 nautical mile buffer is the standard minimum for strong cells. The rule remains, never intentionally penetrate a strong thunderstorm cell. Even cells that look only moderately intense on radar can contain extreme turbulence, hail, or icing aloft. During the climb, or later in cruise, if significant turbulence is anticipated or encountered, the first priority is securing the cabin.
Seatbelt sign on early.
Absolutely. Turn on the fasten seatbelt sign well in advance, make an announcement, and advise the cabin crew to be seated if severe turbulence looks likely. It's all about protecting passengers and crew from injury.
Okay, what about clear air turbulence, CAT? That sounds sneakier.
It is sneakier because, as the name implies, it often occurs in perfectly clear skies with no visible clouds to warn you. Ski is most commonly associated with jet streams, particularly the shear zones around the edges of the jet core, or with mountain wave activity. Since you can't see it coming, we rely heavily on forecasts that predict areas of likely CAT, looking at things like tropopause height, wind shear gradients, and jet stream locations, and crucially on pilot reports, or PI reps, from aircraft ahead of us.
So if someone ahead reports severe CAT at flight level 350,
You definitely want to avoid flight level 350. The usual strategy for dealing with encountered CHAT is to request an altitude change from ATC. Often, climbing or descending just 2,000 to 4,000 feet can move you out of the most turbulent layer. However, there's a caution here. If you're already cruising close to your maximum certified altitude, encountering turbulence significantly narrows your safe airspeed margin. The gap between stalling at low speed and encountering buffet at high speed gets smaller. Climbing higher might not be the best option then.
so what's the immediate action when you hit unexpected turbulence?
If you hit moderate or severe turbulence unexpectedly, the immediate action is to slow the aircraft down to its designated turbulence penetration speed, or rough air speed, often called VBA or MARA. This speed is designed to minimize structural stress on the airframe during large gusts. You disconnect the autopilot if necessary, maintain wings level using smooth control inputs, and, importantly, accept altitude deviations rather than aggressively chasing the altitude. You essentially try to ride the waves rather than fighting them, letting the aircraft move with the air mass while keeping it under control and minimizing stress.
Riding the wave, not fighting it. And the ultimate golden rule for thunderstorms in cruise, it's still absolute avoidance, right? What makes that particularly challenging sometimes, maybe flying at night or over vast oceans?
Absolutely, 100%. Avoidance, not penetration, remains the unbreakable rule for en route thunderstorms. You give those towering cumulonimbus clouds a very wide berth. 20 nautical miles horizontally is the minimum, more is better, and ideally 5,000 feet vertically, especially staying clear of the downwind side, where hail can be thrown out great distances from the storm's anvil top. You use your weather radar's tilt function, strategically scanning up and down to get a full picture of the vertical development of storms ahead.
And night or oceanic makes it harder.
It definitely does. Flying at night or through areas where thunderstorms are embedded within larger cloud layers is particularly dangerous because you lose those visual cues. You can't see the towering clouds or the lightning flashes as easily. You become almost completely reliant on the weather radar, which requires careful interpretation. Over vast oceanic areas, ATC radar coverage is often limited or non-existent, and communication can be less immediate. So the responsibility for identifying, interpreting, and avoiding hazardous weather falls even more heavily on the flight crew's shoulders. You rely more on onboard radar, satellite weather depictions if available, and reports from other aircraft on shared frequencies.
And there are, again, some profound and tragic lessons from major accidents that really hammer home the need for this vigilance, even way up high in the seemingly calm cruise phase of flight.
Indeed. We mentioned Southern Airways 242 earlier, the DC-9, that inadvertently flew into an embedded thunderstorm they couldn't visually avoid while trying to pick their way through. The intense hail and rain they encountered caused catastrophic damage and flamed out both engines, leading to that desperate, unpowered crash landing on a highway.
A devastating outcome from weather penetration.
And a more recent, equally tragic example that resonates deeply is Air France Flight 447 in 2009. That was an Airbus A330 flying at cruise altitude over the Atlantic at night. They flew into an area of intense convective activity associated with the Intertropical Convergence Zone. It's believed that high-altitude ice crystals within the storm rapidly clogged the aircraft's pitot tubes, the sensors that measure airspeed,
Leading to unreliable airspeed.
Exactly. Unreliable airspeed indications cause the autopilot and autothrottle to disconnect. This, combined with the turbulent conditions and the crew's apparent confusion about the aircraft's actual flight state, tragically led to an aerodynamic stall at high altitude from which they never recovered. The aircraft crashed into the ocean. The message from these incidents, and others like them, is devastatingly clear. Even in cruise, severe convective weather is potentially deadly if not actively avoided. No flight plan routing is ever set in stone if hazardous weather lies ahead. You communicate early and clearly with ATC to request deviations. Controllers understand weather avoidance is a top safety priority and will almost always accommodate reasonable requests.
What about icing during climb and cruise? We often associate icing with lower altitudes, but can it still be a factor higher up? Maybe in different ways?
It absolutely can be a factor, yes. While the most severe airframe icing typically occurs at lower altitudes and temperatures closer to freezing, icing can still be encountered during climb or in cruise, particularly when flying through visible moisture in stratiform cloud layers or within the upper levels of convective clouds. And as the Air France 447 tragedy highlighted, high-altitude ice crystals, which might not always show up clearly on radar or cause traditional airframe icing, can still pose a significant threat, especially to engine operation and air data sensors like pitot tubes.
So proactive use of anti-ice is key.
Proactive use is definitely key. At the first sign of potential icing conditions, visible moisture combined with temperatures near or below freezing, or specific alerts from onboard ice detection systems, you should turn on the engine anti-ice systems and wing anti-ice if appropriate for the aircraft type and conditions. You continuously monitor airspeed trends and engine performance indications. Ice beginning to accrete on the airframe or engine inlets sometimes manifests subtly at first, perhaps as a slight decrease in airspeed for a given power setting, or maybe unusual engine vibrations.
And if you encounter severe icing?
If you encounter icing conditions that seem to be overwhelming the aircraft's anti-icing systems, meaning ice is accumulating despite the systems being on wear, you must take immediate action. Request an altitude or course change from ATC to exit the icing conditions as quickly as possible. Don't just sit there hoping it will get better. And be particularly aware of that risk of glaciated icing or ice crystal icing at very high altitudes in the tops of convective clouds. As mentioned, it might not cause visible icing on the windshield wipers or probes, but it can still lead to engine power loss, damage, or even flameout. If you're flying through convective cloud tops, having engine anti-ice and continuous ignition selected is often a very prudent measure. Remember, anti-ice systems are generally designed to prevent ice buildup, not necessarily remove large accumulations once they've formed. So being proactive is crucial.
Another en route weather phenomenon, particularly relevant on long-haul flights, are jet streams. How do these powerful rivers of air affect the flight, and what's the pilot strategy for dealing with them?
On long cruise segments, especially polar routes or transoceanic flights, you will almost certainly encounter the jet stream at some point. These are high-altitude ribbons of very strong wind, often exceeding 100 or even 150 knots. They can be incredibly beneficial if they provide a tailwind, significantly reducing flight time and fuel burn.
Free speed.
Exactly, free ground speed. But conversely, if you're flying against the jet stream, that strong headwind can dramatically increase flight time and fuel consumption. Flight planning software used by dispatchers is very sophisticated at forecasting jet stream positions and strengths and planning optimal routes and altitudes to either take advantage of tailwinds or minimize the impact of headwinds.
Is there turbulence associated with them?
Yes, very often. Strong turbulence, particularly CCAT, frequently accompanies jet streams, especially along the boundaries or sheer edges of the jet core where the wind speed changes rapidly over a short distance. So if you're enjoying that 150-knot tailwind, you also need to be prepared for potential bumps. If you find yourself battling an unexpectedly strong headwind, you might discuss with ATC or dispatch about potentially changing altitude. Sometimes climbing or descending a few thousand feet can put you into a significantly different wind band. But it's always a trade-off between wind, fuel burn at different altitudes, and potential turbulence. And a really critical safety principle, especially when dealing with any kind of abnormal situation en route, is to avoid compounding problems. For instance, if you have an engine failure or some other significant malfunction, the last thing you want to do is fly into a thunderstorm or an area of severe icing while you're already dealing with that primary emergency. Your workload is already high. Adding severe weather into the mix is extremely dangerous. So diligent en-route weather awareness and avoidance becomes even more critical during abnormal or emergency situations.
Use all the tools available.
Use absolutely everything. Modern technology like ACAR's data link weather updates, sophisticated onboard weather radar, satellite imagery downlink on some aircraft, these are invaluable. And never, ever hesitate to use the radio. Ask ATC for help request updated weather ahead. Ask for ride reports from other aircraft in the area. Request block altitudes if you need maneuvering room to deviate around weather. Experienced pilots often develop a sense that comfort is safety. Meaning, sometimes accepting a slightly less fuel-efficient altitude that provides a smoother ride is far preferable for both passenger comfort and overall safety than staying at the optimal altitude if it means battling continuous moderate or severe turbulence. Your passengers will definitely thank you for the smoother ride.
That makes a lot of sense. So, wrapping up the en route phase, it's all about strategic avoidance, constant monitoring using all your resources, and keeping the ride as smooth and safe as possible. Stay out of Mother Nature's worst temper tantrums up there. Okay, so we've successfully navigated the climb and cruise. Now we begin the descent and approach phase. This is where arguably the workload gets really high again, and weather hazards often intensify as you get closer to the ground. This phase really tests a pilot's discipline, particularly sticking to that critical mantra: stabilize the approach and go around. Adverse weather truly puts that discipline to the test. What's the mindset shift as you start heading down toward the destination?
The mindset definitely shifts towards heightened vigilance and incredibly meticulous planning and execution. When the weather at the destination is poor, low clouds, low visibility, strong winds, precipitation descent planning needs to start much earlier than on a clear day. You need to get the latest ATIS, Automatic Terminal Information Service, or METAR for the destination well in advance, usually via data link or voice report from ATC.
Why start planning so much earlier?
Because poor weather almost inevitably means potential delays. Air traffic flow rates into the airport will likely be reduced, meaning holding patterns are probable, or ATC might issue speed reductions much earlier in the descent. So you need to configure the aircraft early, perhaps select flaps or extend landing gear earlier than usual if holding is expected, to stay within speed limits for the holding pattern. You also need to plan your anti-ice usage carefully during the descent if you're descending through cloud layers with temperatures near freezing.
Engine anti-ice on.
Engine anti-ice on, definitely. And usually selecting continuous ignition as well, just as a precaution against flame out and heavy precipitation or icing. If turbulence is expected during the descent, maybe from passing through convective layers or strong winds at lower altitudes, you need to ensure your airspeed remains at or below the recommended turbulence penetration speed, and crucially, make sure the passenger seatbelt sign is securely on well before you hit the bumps. Then, as you transition from the descent phase to the actual instrument approach, the briefing becomes critical. You brief the approach procedures with all the potential weather contingencies firmly in mind. You pay extra special attention to reviewing the missed approach procedure because the likelihood of actually having to fly it is much higher when weather is near minimums.
You set your decision altitude?
You set your decision altitude, DA, for a precision approach like an ILS, or your minimum descent altitude, MDA, for a non-precision approach, and you mentally commit to executing the missed approach immediately if the required visual references aren't seen by that point. If you're planning to use the autopilot for an autoland in Category 2 or 3 low visibility conditions, you meticulously confirm all the necessary systems are armed and working correctly, and you cross-check the flight mode enunciations on your display constantly to ensure the automation is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
What about non-precision approaches in bad weather? Any specific techniques?
Yes, for non-precision approaches, especially in challenging weather, using a continuous descent final approach, CDFA technique, is highly recommended and often standard procedure now. This involves calculating a constant descent path, similar to an ILS glide slope, rather than doing the old dive and drive method of descending quickly to the MDA and then flying level. CDFA significantly reduces the risk of descending below the safe altitude prematurely. But the absolute key mindset throughout the entire approach in adverse weather is, do not let the weather rush you. If there's a line of thunderstorms moving towards the airport, the temptation to speed up and beat the storm can be immense.
Get their itis again.
Exactly. But rushing almost always leads to errors or an unstabilized approach. It is always, always better to go into a holding pattern, wait for conditions to improve, or even divert to your alternate, than it is to force a rushed, unstable approach into deteriorating weather.
And there's a hard regulatory line here too, isn't there? Something called the approach ban. Why is that rule so important for safety?
Yes, the approach ban is a critical safety gate in many parts of the world. Essentially, it states that if the reported weather at the airport, usually the RVR visibility is below the published minimums for the specific approach you intend to fly, you are legally prohibited from continuing the approach beyond a certain point, typically 1,000 feet above the airport elevation.
So you can't even start the final descent if it's already below limits.
Generally, you can start the approach, but you cannot descend below that 1,000-foot gate unless the reported weather improves to at or above the required minimums before you reach that point. If it hasn't improved by then, a missed approach and likely diversion is mandatory. It's a hard line in the sand designed specifically to prevent crews from pressing on into conditions where a successful landing is statistically unlikely or impossible, based purely on hope or optimism. It forces that safe decision early. Now, wind shear and microburst alerts become particularly critical again during the approach phase. The final approach path, especially below 1,000 feet, is prime territory for these dangerous phenomena, particularly if there are thunderstorms nearby or strong, gusty frontal systems moving through.
So you're listening intently for reports.
Absolutely. You pay extremely close attention to any PIRFs from preceding aircraft about wind conditions on final, and especially to any advisories or warnings from ATC based on airport wind shear detection systems like Terminal Doppler Weather Radar, TDWR, or LLWAS. If ATC issues a specific warning like microburst alert confirmed, expect a 30-knot airspeed gain followed by a 40-knot loss on final, or something similar.
That's a definite no-go.
That is an absolute no-go situation. You execute an immediate missed approach. Or if you're further out, you advise ATC you cannot accept the approach under those conditions and request holding until it clears. Similarly, if your own aircraft's reactive wind shear warning activates that wind shear call-out during the approach, the response must be instantaneous, maximum thrust, pitch up to the escape guidance attitude, follow the procedure precisely, and climb away. No hesitation, just immediate trained reaction.
This sounds almost identical to the threat during takeoff. And again, there's a tragic textbook example of what happens when wind shear isn't recognized or escaped in time on approach. Delta Airlines Flight 191?
That's right. Delta 191, an L-1011 wide-body flying into Dallas-Fort Worth, DFW, back in 1985. On final approach, they inadvertently flew into a powerful microburst associated with a nearby thunderstorm. The resulting performance-decreasing shear the downdraft and tailwind violently cut their airspeed and pushed the aircraft down into the ground, crashing short of the runway with devastating consequences. 137 people died.
Unsurvivable.
Largely unsurvivable. The speed at which it happened was terrifyingly fast, based on the flight data recorder. One moment, they were on a seemingly normal approach path. Seconds later, the ground rushed up. The lesson reinforced by Delta 191 and other similar incidents is that every single approach conducted in or near convective weather must have a wind shear escape plan mentally primed. If anything looks, sounds, or feels wrong during the approach, sudden, large airspeed fluctuations, more than 15 knots, excessive sink rates, the ground suddenly looking too close, you execute a go-around before you get caught deep within the shear. Trust the aircraft's warnings, trust the ATC reports, and trust your own pilot instincts. A go-around is always the safer option when wind shear is suspected.
So even with all the technology, it ultimately comes down to that keen observation, trusting your gut, and making that decisive go-around call early. What about landing in really low visibility, deep fog, heavy blowing snow? That must demand incredible precision and intense focus. What's it actually like from the flight deck perspective? It absolutely does demand exceptional precision and unwavering focus. Landing in very low visibility, like Category 2 or 3 conditions, requires using every available aid to its maximum potential. That means relying heavily on the Instrument Landing System, ILS, or potentially a GPS-based GLS signal for precise lateral and vertical guidance. Using the autopilot for a coupled approach, and potentially an autoland, is standard procedure in Cat 3 conditions. You also rely heavily on the approach lighting system, specific patterns of high-intensity lights leading to the runway threshold, and possibly a head-up display, HUD, if the aircraft is equipped, which projects critical flight information onto a transparent screen in the pilot's forward view. So you're watching the automation very closely.
Meticulously. In an autoland scenario, you're monitoring the system's performance, cross-checking flight mode enunciations to ensure it's tracking correctly, and you're poised to take over manually and initiate a go-around immediately if anything deviates or doesn't look right. If you're hand-flying an approach down to minimums in low visibility, say Category A conditions, it's like walking a tightrope. A common trap is inadvertently letting the aircraft drift slightly low or high on the glide slope due to limited visual cues or physiological illusions like the somatogravic illusion where acceleration feels like pitching up. This is why maintaining a strict, disciplined instrument scan right down to the decision altitude or height is crucial. You only transition to visual cues once you positively identify the required references like the approach lights or the runway environment itself.
And the crew communication is vital then.
Absolutely critical. The pilot monitoring makes standard callouts like approaching minimums, and then identifies any visual cues, approach lights in sight, runway environment in sight, continue, or, crucially, no contact, go around. If nothing required is seen by the minimums point, the go-around must be initiated promptly and without hesitation. You also have to guard against visual illusions in fog, like autokinesis at night where stationary lights can appear to move. Again, you trust your instruments until the landing is absolutely assured visually. And landing in heavy rain or snow brings its own challenges even after you see the runway. You have to anticipate a longer landing roll due to reduced braking effectiveness, use maximum available reverse thrust and auto brakes, and be acutely aware of the potential for hydroplaning if there's standing water or slush. And that brings us back, unfortunately, to American Airlines Flight 1420 at Little Rock one more time. Remember, they landed in a severe thunderstorm.
Right, fast, wet, runway, crosswind.
Exactly. And critically, they touched down without the spoilers armed or the auto brakes selected. The crew had become overloaded by the intense weather and workload during the approach and missed these crucial configuration items. Without spoilers to dump lift and auto brakes to initiate immediate braking, the aircraft simply couldn't start on the rain-soaked runway and ran off the end at high speed, resulting in fatalities. The lesson is profound and directly applicable here. For any landing in adverse weather, a stabilized, fully configured approach with all landing systems correctly set up, spoilers armed, auto brakes selected, flaps set is absolutely essential to ensure you can achieve the predicted landing distance safely. If you cannot achieve that stable, configured state by a certain point on the approach, usually 1,000 feet, the only safe option is to go around or divert. Period. No exceptions.
So it's not just about getting to the runway threshold correctly. It's about being fully prepared to stop safely once you touch down. And strong crosswinds or gusts must complicate that stopping part even further, especially on a wet or slippery runway. What's the physical challenge like in those last few feet and during the rollout?
Oh, they complicate it significantly. Landing with a strong, gusty crosswind, particularly on a runway that's wet, icy, or contaminated, is one of the most demanding tasks a pilot faces. You have to precisely execute your practiced crosswind landing technique, whether that's maintaining a crab angle into the wind until just before touchdown and then kicking the rudder to align with the runway, or using the wing low method where you lower the upwind wing and use opposite rudder to maintain alignment.
How do gusts affect that?
Gusts add a whole layer of unpredictability. You generally approach slightly faster than normal, adding a correction to your approach speed, often half the gust factor to maintain better control authority and energy through the variable wind conditions. Using a lower flap setting, if performance permits, can also sometimes help by making the aircraft slightly less susceptible to gusts. You have to be ready for the wind to change rapidly near the ground, so you avoid reducing power to idle too abruptly during the flare. You might need a burst of power to counteract sink caused by a sudden lull in the wind.
And once the wheels are down?
As soon as the main wheels touch down, you immediately apply decisive into-wind aileron input. This helps keep the upwind wing down, plants the upwind landing gear firmly on the runway, and prevents the wind from lifting that wing and causing a sideways drift or skip. Then, during the rollout, you use rudder to maintain directional control down the center line while carefully modulating the brakes, whether using auto brakes or manual braking, to achieve the required deceleration without locking up wheels, which could lead to skidding or reverted rubber hydroplaning on wet surfaces. And this is absolutely key. If, during the flare or after touchdown, the aircraft starts to drift uncontrollably sideways or you realize you've floated too far down the runway and stopping distance is becoming marginal, you must execute a go-around or a balked landing. It's always better to make another attempt or divert than to risk running off the side or end of the runway trying to salvage a landing that's gone wrong.
Modern airliners can handle pretty high crosswinds, though, right?
They can handle remarkably high crosswinds on dry runways. Certified limits can be 38 knots or even higher for some large aircraft, but those limits are drastically reduced, often by regulation or company policy, when the runway is wet, slippery, or contaminated. Braking action becomes a limiting factor. You must always cross-check the calculated landing distance required for the current conditions, wind, weight, runway contamination, against the actual landing distance available at the airport. If the margin is tight or non-existent, landing is not a safe option.
And sadly, there's one more powerful cautionary tale related to pressing at approach beyond limits in terrible conditions. Sudan Airways Flight 109.
Yes, Sudan Airways 109 and Airbus A310 in Khartoum back in 2008. This serves as a really poignant reminder of the dangers of pressing on. The crew attempted to land in what was described as a severe sandstorm or dust storm, Haboob, with extremely poor visibility and strong, gusty winds associated with it. They executed a missed approach on the first attempt.
But they tried again.
They tried again, apparently under immense pressure and still facing extremely challenging conditions. Tragically, the aircraft crashed on landing during that second attempt, resulting in 28 fatalities. This incident starkly highlights the perils of continuing an approach when visibility, wind, or runway conditions are clearly beyond safe operational limits. Dust storms, like intense thunderstorms or heavy fog, can reduce visibility to near zero and often create dangerous gust fronts similar to microbursts. The truly prudent, professional decision in such impossible conditions is to hold well away from the hazard, wait for significant improvement, or divert to a suitable alternate before fuel state or worsening conditions force your hand into a desperate situation. It comes back to that old, wise aviation adage. It's better to be on the ground wishing you were up there than up there wishing you're on the ground. If the weather at your destination is genuinely below minima, or some freak storm hits, be it fog, a blizzard, a sandstorm, whatever, do not hesitate to divert. An uneventful landing at your alternate, even if inconvenient, is always, always a win compared to risking a harrowing approach that might end in disaster.
Absolutely. So, the critical phases of flight are behind you, but the journey isn't truly over until you're safely parked at the gate. Even after the wheels have touched down and you're rolling out, there are still critical post-flight considerations, especially after navigating adverse weather.
That's exactly right. The touchdown and rollout phases are still very much part of the landing, and weather continues to exert its influence. First off, the touchdown technique itself. We mentioned landing firmly in crosswinds or heavy rain. No long floating flares. You want to get the wheels on the ground positively to ensure the aircraft sticks, minimizes drift, and allows braking and reverse thrust to become effective immediately. On a very wet or flooded runway, that firm touchdown helps break through the water layer to the pavement below, reducing the risk of that dangerous hydroplaning where the tires essentially skid on water.
And using all the stopping power available.
Using it appropriately, yes. That means deploying reverse thrust as needed for the runway length and conditions. And using the auto brake system, if available, it provides consistent programmed deceleration, which is really helpful on slippery runways. If using manual braking, you apply firm, steady pressure, being mindful not to lock the wheels if the anti-skid system were to malfunction, though that's rare. You also need to monitor brake temperatures after landing, especially following a high-weight landing or heavy braking on a contaminated runway. Overheated brakes can lose effectiveness or even pose a fire risk. And be aware that braking action on ice can sometimes fade unexpectedly as the heat from braking momentarily melts the ice, which then refreezes. And crucially, you pay extremely close attention to those braking action reports given by ATC or preceding aircraft. They'll usually report braking action as good, medium or fair, poor, or nil. If reports are coming back as poor or especially nil, you have to seriously question whether attempting a landing is safe at all. Many runway overrun accidents in winter conditions happen precisely because crews attempted to land with known poor or nil braking action and simply couldn't stop in the available distance. You have to maintain the mindset that any landing is optional right up until the point your wheels are firmly on the ground within the touchdown zone. You always retain the option to execute a go-around from a very low altitude, or even initiate a balked landing applying full takeoff go-around, TOGA, thrust after touchdown, if you have sufficient runway remaining and something goes seriously wrong, like directional control loss. Though executing a go-around after touchdown is a high-risk maneuver and should ideally be avoided by making the go-around decision much earlier before touching down.
Okay, so you're safely slowed down, turning off the runway. But the vigilance can't drop yet, right? Especially in low visibility or ongoing bad weather. What are the remaining pitfalls on the way to the gate?
Absolutely not. You don't relax until the engines are off and the parking brake is set at the gate. You must maintain full situational awareness and a sterile cockpit environment while taxiing clear of the runway and navigating the taxiways to the gate. In dense fog or heavy falling snow or rain, it's surprisingly easy to get disoriented or miss a turnoff. You have to ensure you don't inadvertently taxi onto another active runway while trying to vacate the one you just landed on. Runway incursions are a serious risk in low visibility.
So back to using the airport diagram and ground control.
Precisely. Use your electronic airport map display, follow ATC ground control instructions meticulously, and monitor their communications with other aircraft. If you are ever unsure of your exact position or your taxi clearance limit, the safest thing to do is always to stop the aircraft in a safe location and ask for clarification. Don't guess. You also need to consider the ongoing weather effects on the ground even after landing. For instance, if that lightning alert is still active, the ground crew might not be able to approach the aircraft immediately when you arrive at the gate for safety reasons. You just have to be patient. If severe weather like very high winds is continuing, you try to park the aircraft facing into the wind if possible and ensure the parking brake is securely set, or that ground crew places chocks promptly before you release the brakes. It's all about leaving the aircraft in a safe and secure state for the next crew, maintenance, or just for the night.
And finally, after the flight is completely over, passengers off, engines shut down, are there any specific post-flight inspection considerations that might arise specifically because of the adverse weather you just flew through?
Yes, potentially. After a flight that involved encountering significant weather, say flying through turbulence, heavy precipitation, potential icing, or especially if there was known lightning activity in the area, both diligent pilots during their post-flight walk-around and certainly airline maintenance personnel will often conduct a slightly more detailed external inspection of the aircraft.
What are they looking for?
They'll be looking for any telltale signs of issues caused by the weather. Things like small burn marks or pitting on the fuselage or wingtips, which could indicate a lightning strike, any dents on the leading edges of the wings, tail, or engine inlets that might suggest a hail encounter. Or perhaps excessive accumulation of mud, snow, or ice in the landing gear wells or on actuators. While the detailed inspection is primarily a maintenance responsibility, a conscientious pilot always does a thorough walk-around after every flight and should report anything unusual they observe. It's just another small but important layer in the overall safety culture of aviation.
What a comprehensive journey we've taken today, exploring the intricate world of adverse weather operations from start to finish. It really underscores that it requires this truly holistic, phase-of-flight approach and an absolute, unwavering readiness to change plans at any moment. Weather, as you said right at the start, is often the top external threat facing pilots, but it's clearly one that can be significantly mitigated through knowledge, preparation, and discipline.
That's it, exactly. And it's worth remembering that almost every significant weather-related accident throughout aviation history, as tragic as each one was, has contributed invaluable lessons. These lessons haven't been forgotten. They've been systematically analyzed and built directly into today's pilot training programs, aircraft technologies, ATC procedures, and airline standard operating procedures, SOPs. From the absolute necessity of timely diversions learned from incidents like Avianca 52's fuel starvation, to the rigorous, non-negotiable de-icing procedures reinforced by Air Florida 90's fatal icing mistake, to the development and constant refinement of wind shear detection and escape techniques following tragedies like Delta 191 and Pan Am 759, we genuinely fly more safely today because we learned, often the hard way, from the past. Each incident becomes a powerful case study, ensuring those hard lessons aren't repeated.
So the ultimate bottom line for any pilot, regardless of experience level, but perhaps especially for those with significant experience who might risk complacency, is to remain profoundly humble in the face of nature's power. Experience is invaluable, certainly, but it should always manifest itself as heightened vigilance and prudent decision-making, never ever as complacency or overconfidence. There's an old safety saying, the weather is not in your control, but how you react to it is.
That sums it up perfectly. By meticulously controlling our actions through rigorous planning, careful execution, adherence to procedures, effective communication, and decisive action when needed, we effectively stack the odds heavily in favor of a safe outcome, even on days when the weather is doing its absolute worst. This systematic approach ensures that, the vast majority of the time, everyone arrives safely. Modern airliners like the A320s and 737s we fly every day are true marvels of engineering, incredibly capable of handling a wide range of challenging weather conditions when operated correctly. But ultimately, pilot decision-making remains the final, crucial safety net. Adverse weather operations demand that we utilize all our available resources effectively. The technology like radar and anti-ice systems, the regulatory framework providing safety buffers like fuel reserves and alternates, the critical teamwork between the flight crew, cabin crew, dispatch, and air traffic control, and perhaps most importantly, applying those hard-earned lessons learned from aviation history.
So for every pilot out there, each flight undertaken in challenging weather becomes this ongoing exercise in both discipline, sticking to the procedures, maintaining stability and adaptability, being ready to change the plan when conditions demand it. By respecting weather's immense power, never underestimating the risks involved, and consistently applying sound judgment and established best practices, we honor those lessons from the past and fulfill our primary responsibility, keeping our passengers, our crew, and our aircraft safe. Fly smart, fly prepared, and always remember that safety is the only destination that truly matters in the end. A quick reminder to always refer to your aircraft's manuals for the official guidance. These manuals are the definitive source of information and should be your primary reference. That wraps up today's episode of the Captain Podcast. I'm the Captain, and it's been a pleasure hosting an airline pilot and expert. Make sure you subscribe and like our content to support us. Comments are welcome. We take your suggestions seriously. Thanks for listening. Fly safe, stay sharp, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Captain Podcast.